A crew member on a routine flight accidentally yanked the wrong lever and sent a live nuclear bomb plummeting onto a family's home in South Carolina. On at least two separate occasions, one person's gut feeling was the only thing standing between us and full-scale nuclear war. These aren't movie plots. They actually happened. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 historical decisions that could have ended the world. 25. Downing a passenger plane. On September 1st, 1983, Soviet fighter jets took down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it drifted into restricted airspace over the Sea of Japan. All 269 people on board lost their lives. The plane had veered off course, likely due to a navigation error, but Soviet commanders treated it as a spy mission and gave the order to fire. The reaction was immediate. President Reagan publicly called it an act of barbarity, and NATO allies lined up to condemn the Soviet Union right alongside him. Military forces on both sides went on higher alert, and for weeks, every diplomatic conversation carried a real undercurrent of hostility. What made this moment especially dangerous was the timing. The Cold War was already at a boiling point in 1983, and this incident poured gasoline on it. Combined with other events later that same year, the incident pushed the two superpowers dangerously close to confrontation that neither side could have walked away from. 24. The Cuban Missile Crisis. American spy planes spotted them first. In October 1962, surveillance photos revealed Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President Kennedy responded with a naval blockade and demanded that the weapons be removed. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stared each other down while the rest of the world held its breath. The math was simple and terrifying. A single miscalculation, a rogue submarine commander, or even a stray radar blip could have triggered a launch. Both countries had enough firepower to wipe each other off the map several times over, and neither was blinking. Behind closed doors, Kennedy and Khrushchev were scrambling for a way out. The deal they struck involved the US quietly pulling its own missiles out of Turkey in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba. Nobody advertised that part at the time. The public version was that the Soviets simply backed down, but the reality was far messier and closer to disaster than anyone wanted to admit. Historians widely consider this the nearest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. 23. The Man Who Said No. Captain Vasily Arkhipov might be the most important person in modern history that nobody talks about. During that Cuban Missile Crisis, his Soviet submarine B-59 was lurking near Cuba when American destroyers started dropping depth charges to force it to surface. The crew had been underwater for days with no contact from Moscow. Their air was running out. Temperatures inside the hull had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and two of the three senior officers believed war had already started. They voted to launch the submarine's nuclear torpedo. Arkhipov refused. That one refusal may have saved hundreds of millions of lives. If that torpedo had hit an American ship, the response would have been immediate and overwhelming. Arkhipov's decision stayed classified for decades, and he never received any recognition for it during his lifetime. The world just kept on spinning, completely unaware of how close it came to stopping. 22. Trusting a gut feeling over a computer. Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was having what should have been a routine shift on September 26, 1983. Then, the alarm started screaming. His screen told him 5 American nuclear missiles were heading straight for the Soviet Union. Protocol demanded that he immediately alert his superiors and prepare for retaliation. But something didn't add up. If the US were really launching a first strike, it would have sent hundreds of missiles at once, not 5. Petrov sat there for what he later described as the longest 5 minutes of his life, refusing to pick up the phone. He reported a system malfunction instead. He was right. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had confused the satellite sensors. The whole thing was a glitch. Petrov's gut call may have prevented a full-scale nuclear exchange, but the Soviet military didn't exactly throw him a parade. He was quietly reprimanded for sloppy paperwork and pushed into early retirement. Most of the world didn't learn his name until years later. 21. The NATO drill that looked too real. Most of NATO's yearly war games came and went without raising any eyebrows. But the one in November 1983 was different. The exercise, called Able Archer, simulated the entire process of launching a nuclear strike. NATO practiced moving warheads, shifting alert levels, and cycling through their chain of command. And the whole thing looked disturbingly real from the outside. On the Soviet side, intelligence analysts were already on edge. They had a program specifically designed to flag signs of an incoming Western attack, and Able Archer matched nearly every warning sign on the list. Reports released years later revealed that Soviet commanders quietly moved nuclear-armed units into launch positions during the exercise. One wrong interpretation from either side could have turned a training drill into the real thing. Historians now consider it one of the closest calls of the entire Cold War, and almost nobody knew about it until classified documents surfaced decades later. 20. The training tape nobody removed. Screens at NORAD, the nerve center of America's nuclear defense, lit up on November 9, 1979 with the worst possible news. A massive Soviet missile attack was supposedly underway. Strategic bombers scrambled into the sky. Missile crews across the country went on high alert and began running through their launch procedures. The panic lasted several agonizing minutes before someone figured out what had happened. A training tape simulating a Soviet attack had been accidentally loaded into the live system. Nobody at NORAD had double-checked what was running on the computer that morning, and the system couldn't tell the difference between a drill and reality. The most advanced early warning system on the planet had been fooled by its own training software. New safety protocols were introduced afterward, but the gap between a forgotten tape and a retaliatory launch turned out to be a lot smaller than anyone had assumed. 19. The rocket nobody told Russia about. Norwegian scientists launched a research rocket to study the Northern Lights in January 1995. Completely routine stuff. The problem was that Russia's radar picked it up, and the trajectory looked almost identical to an American submarine-launched ballistic missile heading for Moscow. For the first and only time in history, Russia's nuclear briefcase was activated and placed in front of President Boris Yeltsin. He had minutes to decide whether to order a retaliatory strike. Norway had actually notified Russia about the launch ahead of time, but the message never made it to the radar operators who needed it most. Yeltsin's team eventually determined that the rocket wasn't a threat, but those few minutes are now considered one of the most dangerous moments of the post-Cold War era. The system that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of misunderstanding failed completely. 18. Starving out West Berlin. 2 million people woke up one morning in 1948 to discover that every road, rail line, and canal leading into their part of the city had been shut down. The Soviet Union had decided to squeeze the Western Allies out of Berlin by cutting off West Berlin's access to the outside world. Food, fuel, and medicine were all cut off overnight. The Allies had two options. They could try to break through the blockade with military force and risk open war with a nuclear-armed Soviet Union, or they could find another way. They went with the second option and launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in supplies around the clock for nearly a year. At its peak, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade, but the crisis set the tone for the next 4 decades. It was the first real test of whether the Cold War would stay cold, and the fact that both sides walked away without firing a shot had more to do with luck than anyone would care to admit. 17. Fighting over a canal. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, and Britain, France, and Israel responded by launching a coordinated military invasion. What should have been a regional dispute turned into something far more dangerous when the Soviet Union threatened to step in on Egypt's behalf. Suddenly, nuclear-armed powers were trading warnings. The Soviets hinted at rocket attacks on London and Paris, while the United States pressured its own NATO allies to pull out. Everyone eventually stood down, but the speed at which a Canal dispute nearly dragged the world into a superpower showdown shocked people on every side of it. Colonial-era thinking had collided head-on with Cold War reality, and the whole thing nearly went sideways because nobody in London or Paris stopped to think about what Moscow might do in response. 16. Israel's last resort. The 1973 Yom Kippur War caught Israel completely off guard. Egypt and Syria launched coordinated attacks on two fronts during one of the holiest days on the Jewish calendar, and for the first few days, it genuinely looked like Israel might not survive. As the battlefield situation got worse, reports suggested that Israeli leaders began preparing their nuclear arsenal as a last resort option. If the country's existence was at risk, everything was on the table. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was pouring supplies into Egypt and Syria. The United States responded by raising its global military alert level. American and Soviet forces were suddenly on a collision course over a war that neither of them had started. Diplomatic pressure eventually brought the fighting to a halt, but the Yom Kippur War proved something that strategists had feared for years. A conflict that neither Washington nor Moscow started could still force both of them to the edge, simply because neither one could afford to let the other side's allies win. 15. Tanks at Checkpoint Charlie. American and Soviet tanks rolled up to Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin in October 1961 and parked just yards apart. Engines running, weapons loaded. Crews on both sides stared each other down with orders that left very little room for interpretation. The standoff started over a dispute about Allied access to East Berlin after the wall went up. An American diplomat had been stopped and refused entry, and the US responded by sending armed tanks to the crossing point. The Soviets matched them within hours. For roughly 16 hours, the most dangerous piece of real estate on the planet was a single checkpoint in the middle of a divided city. The standoff wasn't being controlled by generals or diplomats. It was being held together by the discipline of individual tank crews sitting in the cold with their fingers near the trigger. Back-channel communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually pulled both sides back, but for those 16 hours, the fate of Berlin rested on the nerves of a handful of soldiers who never asked to be there. 14. Nuclear neighbors go to war. India and Pakistan have never been great at getting along, and in 1999 the tension boiled over in the disputed Kashmir region. Pakistani soldiers crossed the line of control and occupied positions on the Indian side, sparking heavy fighting at extreme altitude. What made Kargil different from their previous clashes was that both countries had tested nuclear weapons just a year earlier. This wasn't a border skirmish between conventional armies anymore. It was an active war between freshly declared nuclear powers with missiles that could reach each other's major cities in minutes. The flight time between the two countries is so short that there is almost no room for second guessing once someone decides to push the button. The United States stepped in diplomatically and pressured Pakistan to withdraw. It worked, but Kargil exposed a problem for which nobody had a good answer. Two countries with brand new nuclear arsenals and decades of bad blood were now playing by rules that even Cold War superpowers had barely managed to follow. 13. The bomb that almost went off over North Carolina. A B-52 bomber broke apart mid-air over Goldsboro, North Carolina in January 1961 and dropped 2 hydrogen bombs. These weren't dummy weapons. They were fully assembled thermonuclear devices, each far more powerful than anything used in World War II. One of the bombs went through nearly every step required for detonation as it fell. Arming mechanisms kicked in one after another during the descent. By the time it hit the ground, a single low-voltage safety switch was the only thing standing between North Carolina and nuclear fireball. If that switch had failed, the blast would have devastated a massive stretch of the East Coast. And during the height of Cold War paranoia, an unexplained nuclear detonation on American soil could have easily been misread as a Soviet first strike. The chain reaction from that misunderstanding alone is something nobody wants to think about too hard. The incident was classified as a broken arrow event, and the military quietly overhauled its weapons safety protocols afterwards. But the fact that we came that close to accidentally setting off our own weapons on our own soil still hasn't fully sunk in. 12. Launching before asking questions. Both the United States and the Soviet Union adopted something called launch on warning during the Cold War. The concept was as terrifying as it sounds. If radar detected incoming missiles, you didn't wait for confirmation or check whether the alert was real. You just launched. The logic made a certain kind of sense on paper. If you wait until bombs actually hit, your own missiles are gone and you've lost the ability to strike back. So, both sides decided the safest move was to fire first and verify later. The problem, of course, is that every technical glitch, every confused satellite reading, and every radar malfunction suddenly had the power to end civilization. Human decision makers were left with minutes to determine whether the data on their screens was real or broken. And as I've already shown you on this list, those systems got it wrong more than once. 11. Threatening nukes over an island. China began bombarding offshore islands controlled by Taiwan in 1958, and the United States had a mutual defense treaty that forced American military leaders to decide how far they were willing to go. Internal discussions included the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons against Chinese positions. The thinking was that a limited nuclear strike could stop the aggression without triggering a full-scale war. That assumption was dangerously optimistic. The Soviet Union was closely monitoring everything because of its alliance with Beijing, and any nuclear strike, no matter how limited the planners wanted it to be, would have been impossible to contain once the first one landed. The crisis eventually faded on its own, but the casual way military planners discussed dropping nuclear weapons over what was essentially a territorial dispute is one of the more unsettling chapters in Cold War history. These weren't hypothetical war games. Real officials were having real conversations about real targets. 10. Churchill's secret plan to attack the Soviets. The ink on Nazi Germany's surrender was barely dry when Winston Churchill started planning a new war. In 1945, he ordered his military staff to draft Operation Unthinkable, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union using British, American, and even rearmed German forces. The goal was to push Soviet troops out of Eastern Europe before Stalin could tighten his grip. Churchill was convinced that waiting would only make the Soviets stronger, and he wanted to act while the Western Allies still had the upper hand. His own generals told him the plan was reckless. The Soviet army was massive, battle-hardened, and showing no signs of going anywhere. A surprise attack would have likely turned into a grinding war across Europe that neither side could win quickly. And once atomic weapons entered the picture, there was no telling where it would end. The plan was shelved, but the fact that it existed at all says a lot about how fragile the alliance between East and West really was. Former allies were drawing up invasion plans before the victory celebrations had even ended. 9. America's Nuclear Playbook. The US military put together one of the most chilling documents of the early Cold War in 1949. Operation Dropshot was a full-scale war plan calling for hundreds of atomic bombs to be dropped on the Soviet Union. The targets included cities, military bases, and industrial centers, all mapped out in detail with projected casualty numbers and follow-up strategies. Officially, it was a contingency plan, meaning it would only be activated if war broke out. But the level of detail went way beyond just in case. At a time when communication between the two superpowers was limited and suspicion was running high on both sides, the existence of documents like Dropshot made nuclear war feel less like a theoretical risk and more like something powerful people were actively preparing to carry out. 8. The biggest bomb ever built. The Soviet Union detonated the largest man-made explosion in history in 1961 with a weapon called the Tsar Bomb. The shockwave circled the planet 3 times. Buildings hundreds of miles away had their windows blown out. The flash was visible from over 600 miles, and the mushroom cloud climbed more than 40 miles into the sky. The wildest part is that the device was actually scaled back. Soviet scientists had originally designed it to be even more powerful, but reduced the yield because they were genuinely concerned about what the full version might do. Even the toned-down version was staggering enough to change the entire tone of the arms race. Both sides had officially entered a phase where a single weapon can wipe out an entire region. The question was no longer whether these bombs could end the war, it was whether anyone would be reckless enough to use one. 7. South Africa's secret arsenal. Apartheid-era South Africa had a secret that stayed buried for decades. During the 70s and 80s, the regime quietly built a small stockpile of nuclear weapons. The country was increasingly isolated, fighting proxy wars in neighboring states and facing the real possibility that the government might collapse. Building nukes was their insurance policy. The weapons were dismantled in the early 90s as apartheid came to an end, making South Africa the first and only country to voluntarily give up an entire nuclear arsenal. But for roughly 2 decades, one of the most politically unstable governments on the continent had access to weapons that nobody else knew about. If the regime had fallen apart suddenly, or if one of those regional conflicts had taken a bad turn, the situation could have gone somewhere that nobody was prepared to deal with. 6. Gambling with the entire atmosphere. Before the first atomic bomb was ever tested, physicist Edward Teller raised a question that should have stopped everyone in their tracks. He suggested that the extreme heat from a nuclear detonation might ignite the nitrogen in Earth's atmosphere, triggering a chain reaction that would burn the sky and wipe out every living thing on the planet. The scientists at Los Alamos ran the numbers and concluded that it probably wouldn't happen. The cooling effects of radiation would likely prevent a runaway reaction, but nobody could say so with complete certainty. J. Robert Oppenheimer and the rest of the Manhattan Project leadership decided that probably was good enough, and the Trinity test went ahead on July 16, 1945. The atmosphere didn't catch fire. The gamble paid off. But the fact that a group of scientists knowingly rolled the dice on the survival of everything alive based on a mathematical probability is the kind of decision that doesn't get less unsettling with time. 5. Ignoring the doctors during a pandemic. This is the only entry on the list that doesn't involve nuclear weapons, and it might be the deadliest decision of all. During World War I, a vicious strain of influenza started tearing through American military training camps. Doctors saw what was happening and begged military leaders to stop packing thousands of soldiers onto crowded troop ships heading for Europe. Military brass refused. The war effort came first. Those transport vessels became floating incubators. Soldiers crammed into tight quarters spread the virus to each other and then carried it to every port they landed in. What started as a localized outbreak became a worldwide catastrophe within weeks. By the time the 1918 pandemic finally burned itself out, roughly 50 million people had lost their lives. That's more than the war itself claimed. The choice to push troops overseas despite clear medical warnings didn't just cost lives on the front lines. It sent a plague loose on the entire planet, and the world wouldn't see anything like it again for over a century. 4. MacArthur wanted 50 atomic bombs. General Douglas MacArthur didn't just want to fight harder during the Korean War, he wanted to turn Manchuria into a wasteland. When Chinese forces pushed UN troops back, his request to President Truman was blunt. Give him somewhere between 30 to 50 atomic bombs to drop along the Chinese border and across key military targets. On top of that, he had proposed laying down a belt of radioactive cobalt that would make the land uninhabitable for roughly 60 years. Truman looked at what MacArthur was asking for and decided the general had lost perspective. Instead of approving the strikes, he relieved him of command. It was one of the most controversial military decisions in American history at the time, but it very likely prevented the Soviet Union from entering the conflict with its own nuclear arsenal. 3. A dropped wrench in Arkansas. A technician working inside a Titan II missile silo in Damascus, Arkansas in September 1980 dropped a heavy wrench socket. It fell about 80 feet and punched a hole in the missile's fuel tank. The missile was carrying a 9-megaton warhead, the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal at the time. As toxic fuel leaked and filled the silo, Air Force commanders had to make a call: vent the fumes and risk a spark, or seal everything up and hope the pressure didn't build to a breaking point. They chose to vent. Hours later, the fuel ignited anyway. The explosion launched the 740-ton silo door off its hinges and threw the warhead into a nearby field. The safety mechanisms held. The warhead didn't go off. If it had, the blast would have flattened everything for miles. And during the Cold War, an unexplained nuclear explosion on American soil could have triggered the Soviet Union's automated response systems, potentially setting off a full exchange. 2. Losing 4 hydrogen bombs over Spain. A mid-air collision between a B-52 bomber and a refueling tank over Palomar, Spain in 1966 sent 4 hydrogen bombs tumbling out of the sky. 2 of them hit the ground, and their conventional explosives went off on impact, scattering radioactive plutonium across farmland and residential areas. A third disappeared into the Mediterranean and took 80 days to find. The recovery effort was an international nightmare. American and Spanish military teams scrambled to contain the contamination while trying to keep the public calm. Thousands of barrels of radioactive soil eventually had to be shipped back to the United States for disposal. If the conventional explosives had triggered an actual nuclear detonation instead of just spreading contamination, the damage would have gone far beyond the physical. A nuclear explosion on NATO ally soil during peacetime could have been misread by the Soviets as a tactical strike. The entire American nuclear presence in Europe was hanging in the balance on what amounted to a roll of the dice in the physics of the impact. 1. The bomb that fell on a family's house. And finally, for our last entry, a B-47 bomber was flying a routine mission over South Carolina in 1958 when a crew member accidentally pulled the emergency release lever inside the aircraft. A Mark VI nuclear bomb dropped straight out of the plane and landed on a family's home in Mars Bluff, a tiny community that had zero reason to expect a visit from the military's nuclear arsenal. The bomb's conventional explosives detonated on impact, blowing a 75-foot crater in the ground and leveling the house. But the nuclear core, which was stored separately inside the aircraft per military policy, wasn't attached to the weapon. So the bomb went off, but the nuclear part didn't. That policy of keeping the core separate was heavily debated inside the military at the time. Plenty of people argued it was inconvenient and unnecessary. If those voices had won and the core had been installed during that flight, a small town in South Carolina would have been ground zero for something nobody could have explained away or taken back. And there you have it. 25 moments where the fate of the planet came down to a wrench, a phone call, or one person refusing to follow orders. The Cold War ended, but the weapons from this list are still very much around, and the systems that nearly failed haven't all been fixed. If questionable decisions are your thing, click here for 25 dumbest decisions in history. As always, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss out on new content, and I'll catch you again next time. See ya.